Now, as Tunisia prepares to mark 2 years since Kais Saied suspended parliament and assumed executive powers, some NGOs are using the occasion to highlight the country's human rights record. President Saied has found himself accused of a power grab within the North African country, with much political opposition stifled. As the launch point for the majority of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe, Tunisia has also become a key focus for Brussels. The EU just days ago pledging over €100 million to the crippled economy if it helps stem the flow of migrants. France 24's Camille Nedelec spoke to Heba Morayef, regional director from Amnesty International. She told us more about the recent release of opposition politicians in Tunisia.
Sign that were released. That came as a result of a very significant outcry and a lot of mobilization domestically. But first of all, it's important to remind everyone that there are still 7 others detained in that same case. And secondly, the charges against them were not dropped. So they could still face prosecution under these overly broad, unfounded charges that are being brought against them. And the evidence against the entire group is their political acts, its speech, its membership in associations. It's almost an attempt to criminalize, to outlaw opposition politics. And I think that's what's continuing to worry us so significantly at Amnesty. So while it was, to a certain extent, it was a good, so to a certain extent, of course, it was good news for their families to have those individuals released, but because of the many others who remain detained in that case, and also because the charges haven't been dropped, we remain very, very worried about the direction of travel. The authorities have not distanced themselves from that case. They haven't announced an intention to close the investigation. There's been a lot of rhetoric by different public officials at various points. President Kais Saied himself casting suspicion on organizations that receive foreign funding, on NGOs, on civil society. So none of that gives us a sense that there's been a decision to change course. And so we are concerned that we're going to continue to see these kinds of repressive acts in the period to come.
And it's not just political opponents that are in the crosshairs of the authorities in recent months, is it? There was also increased focus on migrants in Tunisia. The EU is now saying that it will pledge nearly €1 billion for Tunisia to essentially manage the migration flows into Europe. Is Tunisia's treatment of migrants at odds with European values?
Well, from Amnesty's perspective, Tunisia's treatment of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees is at odds with its obligations under international human rights law. And it's those same international human rights obligations bind European countries in their foreign policies. And what we've seen time and time again in EU relations with North African countries is that the EU has often been complicit in sustaining abusive situations for migrants. I mean, the worst example of this is, of course, Libya, just a neighbor to Tunisia. But the timing of this recent accelerated investment in EU-Tunisia migration agreement discussions, precisely at the same time, right after that xenophobic, racist speech, right after we saw these attacks, we saw arbitrary arrests by Tunisian police, we saw examples where migrants are being detained indefinitely, sometimes subjected to involuntary return. The fact that the EU is turning a blind eye to the timing and steaming ahead with these attempts to at all costs keep migrants, refugees and asylum seekers out is a deeply worrying signal. So European values reflected in international obligations, whether under human rights law or refugee law, are not being upheld by these EU countries seeking to just keep migrants out of Europe at any cost.
Are you optimistic for the future?
I am not optimistic for the future because President Kais Saied has been chipping away at different human rights over the last couple of years. He's sought to undermine judicial independence. He sought to silence some of his most vocal critics. He's taken a number of measures and passed different legislative acts that have really had a chilling effect on the space for dissent within Tunisia. And that combined with the fact that the EU is so solely focused on migration right now and on cooperating with the Tunisian authorities to keep migrants, refugees and asylum seekers out at all costs. That has meant that a lot of EU countries are actually looking the other way when it comes to these serious human rights violations. So it's a rather bleak picture, but ultimately I think we've seen Tunisian civil society mobilize again and again, and some small battles are being won along the way. So the important thing is to protect the space for Tunisian human rights defenders to continue advocating for their different rights that are ultimately set out in the Tunisian constitution, and which they fought for so hardly over the last decades.